We've been trying to get a no-fly zone. This is actually quite important. I hope you can put this out somewhere. Let me talk about this. The KNK, which is the Kurdish National Council, is a coordination of all these different groups of, the HDP in Turkey, the PYD in Syria, various other Kurdish progressive, it's called the Kurdish Freedom Movement, have called for a no-fly zone because I think it's really important to understand what's going on in Rojava. A lot of people, have said, "Oh well, American troops are leaving, great," and obviously we don't want the American troops there in the long term. But it's important to bear in mind that the American troops were basically there as human shields. There's all these observation posts along the border with Turkey who are there so that Turkey does not invade. They have been threatening every chance they get to just go in and kill everybody involved in the YPG, the People's Protection Units and the Women's Protection Units in Rojava. And the reason they hate this so much is they say, well, these people are terrorists because they're linked to the PKK. In fact, the PKK is a very separate organization based in Kandil now in Iraq, but the only real connection they have to the PKK is ideological. They both are inspired by the ideas of Abdullah Öcalan, who is the sort of political leader and intellectual leader. He's been in prison in Turkey for over a decade, pushing 2 decades now, and so it's hardly as if he's actively leading anything. Nobody's actually been allowed to talk to him for years now, except his brother occasionally. But the thing is that he, during the period that he was allowed to testify and write things, put out a whole series of new theoretical ideas, partly inspired by the women's movement within the Kurdish freedom movement, things that were already happening, where he embraced democratic confederalism, the ideas of the American anarchist thinker Murray Bookchin, but in a particularly feminist version of that, which really put women's freedom at the fore and said, moved away from Marxism and said it's no longer primarily the class struggle, gender liberation has to come first, or class struggle will be meaningless. So the PKK really changed. They renounced their demands for a separate state. So all these people refer to them as separatists. It's not true. They say, well, basically we want to dissolve state institutions and decentralize them, but keep existing borders. That's fine. We're not going to challenge the existence of Syria or demand our own country. In fact, most Kurds I know, who live in the region, they'll always say, well, in this part of the world, to demand your own country demand your own government is like saying we demand the right to be tortured by secret police speaking our own language. Oh, great, that's a big improvement. All right, so they don't want that anymore. But they have this ideal of trying to create real grassroots direct democracy, of local councils sort of federating on higher levels, making decisions in a participatory fashion. They've been working really hard for the last 5 years of doing that in Syria as an experiment. They're trying to actually institute and see how they work. These are ideas that anarchists and people like that have been talking about for years. They're really trying to do it. They're trying to do a very, very anti-patriarchal version of that, where insofar as there are like actual offices, all offices have to have one man and one woman. There's also, so no one ever makes a decision alone, but there has to be gender balance and everything. All groups not only have to have a women's quorum, but they have to have an all women's body that will check their decisions and can veto them. So that's how you see the women soldiers. People would say to me, they say, well, we're anti-capitalist, but we've come to realize over the course of the 20th century that it's not that simple. You can't get rid of capitalism without getting rid of the state. And you can't get rid of the state without getting rid of patriarchy. Well, how do you get rid of patriarchy? It's going to be a long and complicated process, but giving all women access to automatic weapons is certainly a start. So when you see those women soldiers, that's not just like they had to mobilize everybody. It was an emergency. It's part of a very self-conscious political program. Now the government of Turkey, which is a far right Islamic, increasingly dictatorship, hates these guys. this is like anathema to them. First of all, they're anti-Kurdish racists to begin with. I mean, even speaking Kurdish was illegal in Turkey for much of the century. They have this absurd idea that Kurds are really mountain Turks. They're Turks that have lost their way. Of course, they're speaking a totally unrelated language by some coincidence, which, in fact, Indo-European, but I don't know how they finesse that. Anyway, so there's anti-Kurdish racism combined with absolute hatred for the political project that's being pursued here. So, I mean, and increasingly the solution to any social problem, certainly anybody presenting a radically different idea of how life should be lived on the part of such authoritarian governments, and by Erdogan in particular, is to simply declare them terrorists and try to kill them. So essentially the argument is that people in North Syria are terrorists, and they just repeat the word terrorist, 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 whenever they possibly can, because they're tied to the PKK. But in fact, the only reason they're tied to the PKK is because they accept the same ideology. But that ideology is one of ecology, women's liberation, and direct democracy. So anybody who embraces women's rights and democracy too much, suddenly they're terrorists now. And the amazing thing is, owing to the fact that Turkey is a NATO ally, Western media has to pay lip service to this and pretend that this is actually true.
So everything in terms of the idea structure. Now you have to excuse me if this sounds controversial in any way, and I don't mean controversial. I mean if this upsets you. But if you look at, we were talking before about equality and inequality, and you said equality is a great argument for a liberal to to get involved in, because it means they can tinker and keep everything the same.
Yeah.
So, for example, the other day, HSBC announced that gender pay gap reporting. Did you hear this? They basically said, so it was only last year that they had to report it for the first time, and the whole point is supposedly to get more women on boards, apparently. Then they do it for the second time, so it's the first year you can measure. It's worse. So it's now 61%, but for every 39 pence a woman earns, a man earns £1.
Wow, that's an amazing gap.
And that's HSBC with a huge advert, probably the biggest bank in the UK. No one is an island. They have this massive advertising campaign at the moment. So what I'm saying is that gender pay gap reporting is there to try and highlight something, and the community that you're talking about, the values that it's got is up front saying we stand for these things. And yet NATO is very happy to be complicit in bombing them.
Yes, and I need to really emphasize this, because the way the discourse has been going, the way people talk about this is very deceptive. Well, they're an extension of American imperialism because they're the only people that the U.S. could find that actually wanted to fight ISIS. So they were forced, despite their extreme hostility to the political project, as you might imagine, to work with them on the ground militarily. So either people say, oh, well, they're just a tool of America or Israel or, whatever it might be.
Who says that?
A lot of people.
Well, ISIS say that?
Well, yes, they do. But ISIS in this, like half the Marxists, I mean half the people in the Stop the War coalition are people like that. In fact, one big problem we've had with rallying even the Labour Party to take a strong position on this is so many of these sort of hardcore anti-imperialist sectarians, Maoists and Leninists and Trotskyists who take this kind of position are, in the labor movement in sort of strategic positions. So it's actually hard to do,
I'm a bit confused. Where does it become okay? So what's the objection here? Is it racial, or is
By whom?
Well, is it an objection from aspects of the left over here, or much of the left over here, to the Kurds because of their geostrategic position, their race?
I think
political. What is the story here? Is it that they threaten the mindset of a communist over here?
No. There's a degree of racism, I think, but the degree of racism takes this form. They're not seen as political actors who are playing in the same stage. Basically, the anti-imperialist mindset, and I mean, there's honest anti-imperialists, but the so-called anti-imperialists, basically they're still playing the Cold War game, despite the fact there's no longer a good guy in their minds. There used to be those guys who would support the Soviet invasion of Hungary or Czechoslovakia, because this is a desperate struggle between the good guys and the bad guys, and even bad things done by the guys I've decided are the good guys must be justified in geostrategic terms. They're like Henry Kissinger, except on the other side, and that's the way these guys are thinking. Nowadays, there isn't even a good guy, but they're still doing it. Anybody who's opposing American imperialism is the good guy. The Assad regime, which is like raped, tortured, and killed, probably 100 people for everyone raped, tortured, and killed by ISIS. Well, they're the good guys because the U.S. says they're the bad guys, so they have to be the good guys. It's my obligation to support whoever the imperialists oppose. The problem with this is they don't seem to realize that what it implies is that international politics is a chess game played by certain powerful actors, most of whom are white males. Some of them are Angela Merkel, or maybe Modi counts as a real actor, maybe not. But basically powerful, mostly white guys are the only people who really count. And the way I think about it politically is this. I say, there's two different instincts that you have. And one of them, okay, let me say this again. Sometimes I say it this way. If you're a lefty, and you look at a conflict in the world, there's two different initial questions you could ask. One of them is, if I lived in, Waziristan or whatever country it is, where I don't really know what's going on, who would I be? What would I want? What would I be trying to do? And how can I help that guy? Or you could say, who's the powerful white guy I hate the most? What does he want out of Waziristan, and how can I stop him? Now, usually those instincts will overlap, because whoever the guy I would like or be, or agrees with me, my general idea of human liberation, is going to want to stop that white guy from doing that. Every now and then there's a conflict. So which of the two you choose tells you a lot about the real nature of your politics. And to me, the one who says, no, what's important is the powerful white guys, and I must stop David Cameron, or whoever it might be, from doing, or Trump or Bush, or whoever the bad guy is at this moment. I must stop them, and that's what really matters. Who cares about these brown people and their complex alphabet soup of different organizations that I don't want to have to memorize anyway? Whatever. It's not my business. And there's the Noam Chomsky argument, which is legitimate, which says, my ultimate responsibility is to undo the damage I myself do, right? So if people who claim to act for me in Europe or America are doing something terrible, I can do something about that. This is why it's silly to say we need to protest Putin just as much as we protest Trump. Well, Putin doesn't care if we protest, but Trump, might be affected in some way. Anyway, he's claiming to act in our name, so we have an obligation to do something. That's true. I agree with that. But, it turns into this thing where they're the only guys who matter, Putin and Trump, and other sort of powerful chess player figures. And the guys who are actually trying to make a revolution on the ground are only interesting insofar as those powerful guys see them as chess pieces. And I think that's ultimately, it has racist implications. It might not be driven by an original racism, but only racism that allows us to do that. It makes us complicit in a global structure of racism.
I have gone from not watching the BBC because I didn't like being lied to saying, come on, give me more of it. Give me more of it. I want to. I
you no longer expect them to tell the truth.
I enjoy it. I really enjoy it now. And they really don't make a big deal out of the thing that we're talking about now. I mean, everything that we've just... I remember I don't even know where I found out that the US and the YPG, I'm not sure what the acronym is, but that they were going to be working together. I can't remember when it was. I remember mentioning it to you, and you said, well, yeah, see how long that lasts.
Nobody imagined it was going to last forever, yes.
Yeah, and so...
The definition of an alliance of convenience. And as people in Syria pointed out to me again and again, this is a military alliance, it's not a political alliance. I mean, the U.S. was not pushing for the Kurdish movement to be represented in the peace talks, for example, even though they control now 2/5 of Syria.
So what can we do over here? And you were saying that there's some people just don't want to know about it because they're too busy saying...
Well, this is what I think people should understand.
Please.
That if American troops leave, that doesn't mean that imperialism is gone. NATO is still there. In fact, NATO is going to be there doing... I'm still a little sexist, so let me know. Okay, let me make this one thing clear. If U.S. troops pull out, which everybody knew they were, that doesn't mean imperialism leaves the region. This is not necessarily a giant victory for imperialism. I personally feel that what Trump is an honest anti-imperialist in some ways, and that he does want to dismantle the American empire or elements of the American empire. He's always said that, and I think he's honest about it. I think he really wants the war in Afghanistan to end. If he had his way, and apparently he tried to pull troops out of Korea, out of Japan, he would take those guys home. He just thinks the whole system is stupid. What he wants to replace it with probably won't be very nice either, but he does honestly believe that this sort of extended global empire based on a combination of military power and finance capital isn't a good thing. On the other hand, much though the dismantling of the empire is something which we've all been waiting for some time, and let's face it, only a right-wing guy could do it. A left-wing president would never be allowed to dismantle the American empire. Or it is nonetheless true that in this particular situation, imperial power is still operating. It's just operating at one slight remove. I mean, remember, empires don't normally operate by sending their own troops. That's fairly unusual. Maybe in the initial phases sometimes. The British Empire didn't send British troops into combat very often. They sent Indian guys, and they sent, Gurkhas and Africans, and, those are the foot soldiers. And in a similar way, you have these different degrees of control. So the Turkish army is part of NATO. And we treat it as if Turkey is some kind of weird rogue state that has to be appeased because otherwise they might align with Russia or Iran or something. It's like they're part of NATO. They're part of a mutual alliance. They can't actually leave NATO, or they're not going to actually leave NATO, because their entire military advantage is based on the fact that they are part of NATO. And people don't understand what NATO means. That means not only do they get to buy stuff, like these German Leopard tanks and the helicopter gunships, and the Italians building them spy satellites, and they have British jets and American missiles and so forth and so on. Okay, they have all that stuff, but what people don't understand is that kind of sophisticated high-tech weaponry, it tends to degrade extremely quickly in combat situations. That is to say, if you're flying around a combat jet for a week, it's going to break. I mean, parts need to be maintained, they need to be replaced, they need to be fixed, and you need people who know how to do that. Those guys aren't Turkish. Those guys are Americans and Germans and French and Italian contractors who are sitting around maintaining, monitoring, inspecting, making the whole thing work. So the Turkish army itself is kind of useless. Ever since the coup, almost all their experienced generals are either fired or are literally in jail. I mean, during the Afrin invasion, they had too few pilots because they were all in jail. So they were actually letting people out of jail to fly combat missions and then putting them back again. This actually happened. So their command control is a disaster as a result. And they have these political appointees who don't know what they're doing. They're good Islamists and they're loyal to the president, but other than that, they have no combat experience. Meanwhile, the guys they would be fighting, and these guys have spent the last 5 years fighting ISIS. They could literally run circles around the Turks. So, they are properly armed. So the other advantage they have from NATO is they're not properly armed. They intervened immediately to say, okay, if you're going to work with these guys, we don't like it, we can't stop you, but you cannot give them anti-aircraft weapons and you can't give them anti-tank weapons, so, good against our tanks. So as a result, Turkish army is in bad shape, but it has these amazing high-tech toys, which are maintained by Europeans and Americans, basically an extension of NATO, and owing to their NATO influence, the Turkish government is guaranteed the guys they are threatening to wipe out and kill don't have weapons that they can defend themselves against those high-tech toys. So the Americans said, okay, we'll be human shields, we'll have observation posts on the border, that way Turkey can't invade because they'd be killing Americans, and we all know they can't do that. Now they're pulling them out. So essentially what they're doing is they are unleashing their own army on the people who just gave 12,000 lives to defeat ISIS for them. and they promise to commit war crimes. I mean, this is not just we think that they will do so. Like before the invasion of Afrin, Erdogan said, "We will return Afrin to its rightful owners." This place was 98% Kurdish, right? And they cleaned out 160,000 people immediately, and they're in the process of using the usual means of terror. They have all these guys who are their ex-ISIS and ex-Al-Qaeda, like a few years ago they were part of that. And essentially the Turkish offensive against ISIS, basically consisted of paying off the commanders to change sides. So why there was basically no fighting in most of the cities they took. There's one point in Al-Bab that they fought for a couple of weeks, largely because apparently the deal hit some kind of snag. I don't really have the inside story on that. But eventually that was reconciled too. So basically all these former ISIS commanders and their guys just would shave off their beards and switch sides. Sometimes they didn't even shave off their beards, and became Turkish auxiliaries. Those guys have been systematically terrorizing the population of Afrin. So they used all these high-tech toys and the missiles and the napalm and the cluster bombs to come in, take over this area, and now they're just systematically, ethnically cleansing it of Kurds. And they basically said they were going to do this before they did it. It's very rare that a group says, "I am going to commit war crimes now," comes in, invades another country, and nobody says anything. What's up with that? And the only way I think it can be explained is that they also said, in addition to saying they were going to ethnically cleanse it, that they would use the place to resettle the families of all the really scary jihadis. So, all the guys you really don't want to go to Europe, we'll put them here. Don't worry. Just let us have this province and drive out the population. So here you have this place. It's part of Rojava. It was a place where 2/3 of all political offices were filled by women. It was an experiment in feminist democracy. It's the very thing that these guys claim they'd love to see in the Middle East. One of the few zones of peace. It's invaded by NATO army, which then starts committing war crimes. Somehow this isn't an international scandal. The only way you can explain that is that it's an extension of Europe's fear of immigrants. What Turkey is doing it's not just a coincidence it's a NATO army, it guards Europe's flank. So they're creating all these wars, there's all this turmoil, people are fleeing for their lives. And Turkey's sort of setting up these barbed wire fences with machine guns and just mowing down immigrants in many cases, and then are taking other ones in and resettling them. They're being directly paid by the EU to do so. So this is imperialism. This is the and look at empires in the past. As I said, the British Army didn't use their own troops either.
Sorry, where?
The British Empire didn't use their own troops for the most part in combat. Occasionally they did. The same way America used their own troops occasionally, but mostly they rely on others.
I know the French, they like to use the Senegalese and those from...
Yeah.
If you were from Brittany, you didn't count as French either, apparently. They would...
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. But my favorite example is Alaric the Goth. He was a Roman general, They would... Romans said, "Oh, it's okay. We'll just hire the barbarians and, co-opt them. Eventually, they'll become Roman. We can take anything, just absorb them." Then one day, Alaric the Goth didn't get a promotion. The rest, as they say, is history. Similarly, Osama bin Laden, was working on the American side in Afghanistan for many years, and they won, and he just turned his attention the other way. So this process of, the Americans are basically using the Turkish army as their formal NATO extension, and the Turkish army is now using the former Al-Qaeda and ISIS guys as their auxiliary extension. This is how empires always work, but, we all know what happened to Alaric and Osama, right?
So essentially the US are using Turkey, and Turkey are using ISIS.
Yeah.
And this is reported in the US, not quite not as directly as that. New York Times, does it mention this type of stuff?
No, the Times just tends to quote Turkish official spokespeople, and sometimes they'll have one little column in the very bottom where they'll have somebody from the Kurdish movement. But they're really bad. People just cite official spokespeople. And the Turkish spokespeople will say completely psycho things. They're just obviously not true. When they invaded Afrin, they said, we are attacking YPG and ISIS targets. It's there's no ISIS people in Afrin. Everybody knows that. Insofar as they were, the Turks just brought them in as their auxiliaries. But a lot of newspapers and magazines in America just reprinted that. Well, it's official spokesman of a NATO ally. The fact that they are a NATO ally means they're allowed to get away with doing and saying things that nobody would take seriously if they weren't. And well, the very fact that we have to say that the PKK are terrorists. PKK haven't blown anybody up who's a civilian, at least in a targeted strike. I mean, I did it by accident a couple of times, in decades.
You know how you were just saying that the US, the US have kind of switched in that area.
Yeah.
So what about the Brits? What's their? They're not.
Well, that's a very interesting question. The British government has had a very, very weird and ambivalent attitude toward the Kurdish movement. On the one hand, there are British troops fighting alongside the YPG in Syria. On the other hand, people who actually...
When you say British troops, you mean British people who have joined?
No, British troops. There are British troops in Syria who are fighting ISIS, and some of them are, alongside the Americans, and there's some French people too. Some of them got wounded the other day. There was an ISIS attack on the YPG unit, and there were some British guys nearby got wounded too. They were fighting there.
So they're with the YPG?
Yeah, in the place where they're actually fighting ISIS.
Together?
Together. At the
sorry,
same time.
I'm sorry, this is very confusing now for me.
Yes, well, it's especially confusing.
Was that in Syria or Turkey?
Syria. In Syria.
Right.
Well, and but Rojava was part of Syria.
Right.
But this is the crazy thing. Right around the same time, there was some British kid who was flying off to Syria to join the YPG, or who had been. He was arrested at the airport as a terrorist. So, on the one hand, we're fighting with them legally, the British Army, they're an ally, but if you try to join them, you're a terrorist. The logic is insane. The way the word terrorism is used is insane. I mean, if you're the Taliban, they'll say, oh, look at these people, they are against women's rights, they're oppressive and patriarchal, they're against democracy, obviously we need to bomb them into the Stone Age because they're a bunch of savages, right? Then you have another movement that they believe in women's rights more than we do. They believe in direct democracy more than we do. Well, they're terrorists too, so we need to bomb them. I mean, it's like, what, do you have to hit the happy medium? Enough women's rights, but not too much? Enough democracy, but not too much? It doesn't make any sense.
So, obviously, we're fairly powerless here, or are we?
What are we?
Well, you and I have this conversation.
I'm doing what I can. I think we all are. I think
Sure.
we're more powerful than we think. We can have an influence here if we... just drawing attention to what's going on. If most people in the world knew that there are people in Syria, of all places, who are trying to create a new society based on, women's participation in every aspect of political life. They're trying to create a new philosophy of beauty and freedom based on women's values. The stuff they're doing there is quite extraordinary. People say, oh, it's not the utopia you think it is. Of course it's not a utopia. It's a revolution. Revolutions are messy things. But the ideals that they are pursuing are remarkable. They're trying to see if it's possible to get rid of patriarchy in the place where patriarchy was essentially born in the Middle East. They're trying to see if it's possible to create a society based on anti-capitalist ecological principles in the middle of the oil belt,
Well, just to say this, earlier on today I was saying to you that the report came out yesterday in which they said we need to regulate the regulator, and then afterwards, who regulates the regulator is the regulator. So we have this kind of capitalism here, and it's as if we want to try and fix it in some way, and by trying to work something out. And then afterwards there's the question of what we can learn from them. And as you said, if anyone here, because at the very beginning of the report it says, shit is fucked up. No? And so that's why when I see people commenting on the FT comments saying, oh, who regulates the regulator, the regulator, what I want to say is, could you put your name down, say who you are, and if you've read those first pages, what it is that you disagree with. Because most of the reasons why people voted for Brexit was obviously because of all of this corruption that's going on.
Yeah, unfortunately it's going to create more of it, it looks like. Well, Brexit's another thing.
But yeah, but that society over there that you were saying of those people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's what's interesting. I mean, it makes me wonder whether a lot of revolutionaries even really believe that a revolution is possible. Because the first reaction they have on finding out that there's a mass popular uprising trying to create a anti-capitalist society based on principles of direct democracy, of women's liberation, is to say, no, I can't believe that. You know, either that or say, well, that doesn't matter. What really matters is that, you know, this evil, imperial power is trying to do this, and this evil imperial power is trying to do that, and this like slightly less evil imperial power is on the other side, so we need to support them, and who cares about those revolutionaries, whatever. Like these guys claim to be lefties. I mean, I don't understand what's happened to us. I call it the loser left. Basically, they don't think they could win. It never occurs to them that a real revolution is possible, that human liberation is really possible. The only thing they can really imagine winning is an argument.
What about the Yellow Jackets?
Oh, what about them?
Well, I really wanted to get you talking about this because...
Well, the Gilet Jaunes are a really fascinating phenomenon. I think that... Well, my first take on it is that it shows just how out of touch with ordinary people left intellectuals are, because nobody in France, in the French establishment, especially the liberal establishment, had any idea what to make of these guys. There was this endless drumbeat of they must be right-wing. Well, they're anti-ecological, they come from small towns or villages, they're working class or petty bourgeois maybe. Well, obviously they've got to be fascist. What else could they possibly be? Rural white people are either fascists or they are nothing. We normally think, oh, they're nothing. But, when they rise up and get political, they're fascists. I mean, it was just this assumption. And it's pretty amusing because everybody kind of wanted them to be fascists. Obviously including the fascists, who immediately kind of came out and tried to take over. And there's all these wonderful scenes of these fascist guys showing up, or far right politicians showing up saying, I shall be your leader, and just basically getting the shit kicked out of them, as people just would physically attack them whenever they showed up, or try to speak for them. They'd just go after them and beat them up. So finally they were afraid to come. I mean, this even happened to me when I was at one of these Gilet Jaunes, it was Act 5. A couple weeks ago, I was in Paris, outside the Arc de Triomphe. They were tear gassing us, and there were pitched battles in the street, and this phalanx of guys marches up with a pirate flag. It was like, pirates, I wonder who they are. Are they anarchists? And then it turned out, no, they were fascists, trying to masquerade as anarchists. And, but there's an Antifa group that said, no, we know who those guys are. And immediately, hundreds of people showed up and attacked them, and they finally had to leave.
Right. So how do you feel when you're out there and you're with that energy? Because I've lived in France, and all my friends were communists when I was there.
Mm-hmm.
And they get together and the police run away from them.
Often. I mean, there's different styles of policing in Northern Europe and Southern Europe, and as in so many things, France, which is the only country which has, border up with the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, tends to go for the more Southern Europe option. The Northern Europe policing is total control, so they'll be relatively restrained, but they're always there. They never let you have the streets. They never let you feel really free, except for tiny moments that you can win. Whereas in France, they tend to more go for the leave you alone or just totally attack you, and they'll go back and forth between those things. And for a while, they were trying to adopt the more American or British or German style, but they seem to have gone back to basics on this one. So sometimes there's just not a cop in sight. You just totally control the city, which is very, very exhilarating. And sometimes they'll just be just completely violent. A lot of people have been seriously injured. The people who lost eyes, or were really grievous, lost a jaw. Really grievous injuries, and it just shows the degree to which these guys who claim to be the reasonable centrist moderates are willing to unleash this total violence on their own people rather than engage in what most of us would consider a reasonable compromise.
What do you think of Extinction Rebellion?
They're interesting. In a lot of ways, the social base of them is not that entirely different. I mean, obviously France is a different country. It's got many more rural people and small town people, but there's a kind of rural basis in Extinction Rebellion, which I find interesting. I'm trying to figure out what's going on with Extinction Rebellion. I think that I was a little wary at the beginning because it didn't seem like it was a grassroots movement. It was more a reflection of a few people's sort of vision. But sometimes it's necessary to do that to start something. And then more and more people get involved, it becomes democratized, and I think there's a will for that, and it's starting to happen. I think it's very promising. And it's similar in a way to the Gilet Jaunes, that people it doesn't fit the normal molds. People wasn't quite sure what to do with it. There's a lot of new people involved who aren't your sort of usual suspect activists. So it's not entirely clear what direction it takes, but I think it's promising.
Well, I mean, one feature of Extinction Rebellion is that they haven't given everybody weapons.
That's a feature of many social movements.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, what I meant is, it's not like in Rojava.
Well, yeah,
where they're fighting ISIS and they were armed.
Well, they have little choice.
Yeah, sure, no.
In Rojava, either you have a weapon or you get killed.
And the Gilet Jaunes obviously are quite happy to, every so often...
Well, I mean, there's rumors about, like, people, like, breaking into armories, but, like, they haven't actually, opened fire on anybody.
Right, okay. So
police are started to come out with automatic weapons.
Right.
A little bit worried about what that might turn into.
In France, you mean?
Yeah, it's starting to.
But over here, the degree of sort of brainwashing and spin and all of that kind of stuff, there's this massive psychological war, which is way, way, way greater in terms of identity than in France. In France, they can just say, let's go old school, we're calling this conflict. Have you heard about Macron's letter?
I'm not sure I have.
So Macron wrote a letter last night to the French people.
Yeah.
And,
is this the one where he accused them of being basically fascists and thugs and all that?
No. Here's one where he basically said, "Okay, look, we need to talk."
You think?
9 weeks in, and he basically said, "Well, I mean, I can't say basically said. All I know is I looked at one aspect of the letter where some people said that he sort of referred to sortition." Like, he didn't use the term, but it was...
This is one of the demands. They've been talking a lot about popular assemblies. They've been talking about how to organize them, and they very much reject representative democracy. They refuse to name spokespeople, delegates they can have, but they don't allow people to, like, speak in their name. Again, a lot of people jumped up and immediately declared themselves representatives of Gilet Jaunes, and those people had to be driven away physically, basically, or threatened with violence.
So that's a little bit like Occupy, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, it's very much like Occupy. I mean, one of the things which fascinates me is the fact that everybody said, oh, Occupy failed, but actually it marks a fundamental break in people's expectations of what a social movement would be like. And the very things that Occupy was criticized for, the refusal to make specific demands of power the centerpiece of what you're doing, because it would imply recognizing the forms of authority, rejecting the decentralization, the use of rejection of representatives and internal power hierarchical structures. All of that has become the default mode. At this point, you can think of 2011 as a world historical break, kind of a world revolution like 1848 or 1968, where political common sense has fundamentally changed. If you look at what happened in Hong Kong or Bosnia, when there was a spontaneous bottom-up democratic movement, it took its form similar to Occupy. Everybody has their own cultural traditions and versions, and it will look different in every country, and as well it should. But it's that basic idea of rejection of demands of representation, of that, or certainly of that idea that the logical thing to do is to form a party and try to seize state power. Basically, the anarchist program has now been normalized.
Did you hear what happened in Korea with the candlelit vigils?
Which one? They're doing that again?
No.
Oh, you mean the Candle Girls?
This is a couple of years ago, or a year or two ago. Somebody told me that, how in Korea...
Candle Girls was about 10 years ago. I was there.
Oh, okay. No,
Candle Girls were cool.
I heard it was quite recently.
Oh, they did Candle Girl again?
There was a leader who'd been there for a long time. He was probably doing 24 years or something now. But that leader, apparently every weekend, people turned up with candles, and they were there all weekend.
Oh, yeah. There's this famous Candle Girl thing. They had this giant, like 8-story tall float of this little girl holding out a candle, going like that, and that was a symbol of rebellion in Korea.
Funny that you say that. You know, on Wall Street they've got a statue of a bull.
Yeah,
And then have you heard about the other statue in front of it?
In front, there's a new one.
Yeah, I think it's called Fearless Girl, but I'm not sure. There's a picture of a little girl.
So they finally did something with the bull. I mean, we had so many
So it's
ideas
a
of what to
statue
do
of
with
a
that
sta-
bull. Yeah, because I mean that's like they had cops around that bull from the very first day that we were planning the occupation. Like that was like the symbolic prize. The cops just like constantly had that thing guarded 24/7 for years, and we were saying, okay, the movement's over when they don't feel they have to guard the bull anymore.